Hey, so this is our second installment of a podcast with LGBA Alliance, and then a few of us. I'm Joss,
Carol,
Ariane.
and today our topic is single-sex spaces.
this
So,
is this is going to be a fun one. So, single sex spaces, as it pertains, I think, especially to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, is pretty important and something I think something we've talked about extensively among each other, but also in some of the discussions we've had. And um, I think it's really important that we have our own spaces and be able to kind of, say, especially, okay, so let's take lesbians, for example. We should be able to say we want to have a space, a group, a get together, an event, whatever, where we don't have any men because we're lesbians and we're only interested in women and we just want to be surrounded by women. And gay men, I think I can speak for them when they say they don't want women in their space either. Um, and the issue we're having now is that the kind of trans rights movement and the kind of ideology that's happening right now is basically saying that anybody can go into any space if they identify with the group of people in that space. So basically, a man can go into a lesbian space if he identifies as a woman, and a woman can go into a male space if she identifies as a man. So and we've seen this happening already in the gay and lesbian and bisexual community, and it's not cool, and it's such I don't know, I think it breaks down so many. It's very disrespectful to boundaries.
yeah, just railroads boundaries right over.
Yeah.
But that's the whole part of identifying as. When if you identify as whatever, um, then it's to me it just like is the skeleton key to all locks on boundaries for you to just identify in and out of whatever.
It's interesting because I remember a while back, I went to a women's college I was class of 2011. So, one thing I remember was there was just a lot of discussion in general about whether single sex spaces were obsolete. A lot of people are like, well, do we need single sex schools or clubs or anything like that? And so I always had this fear that single sex spaces would go obsolete because of that. People saying they were no longer necessary and sort of voluntarily kind of so kind of committing suicide into extinction. I didn't anticipate this particular pathway for them to be obliterated. It's like a virus that's infected them on the inside and it's now like eating them from the inside out. It's a different sort of scenario than I was envisioning 15 years ago.
Well, and
Well,
the we did that to ourselves too with the gays with lesbian spaces, gay spaces was at least for me coming out in the late 90s and early 2000s. That period of time there was a massive shift away from lesbian only bars to say, oh well, we're gonna just go to the really popular spot because they tended to be dive bars, right? Like if we're honest, they weren't the hippest spaces generally, so they could lesbians carry up their heterosexual people and just go out and make it a lesbian night at those spaces. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot in a way, in the same similar way of doing that, with saying we don't need this anymore because we're integrating everything. So we don't need this anymore, but we do need it.
I was curious, Ariane, what was the reasoning that people were giving for not needing single sex spaces anymore?
Well, I mean, the argument you often hear against, say, single sex, like women's colleges, is that they were invented during a time in which women were excluded from men's schools. So, like, the Ivy League was all men. So the Seven Sisters schools were like all female alternatives to that. And so they're like, well, the Ivy League schools are available to men and women. What purpose does the actual women's college serve?
Is
And what
there
do you
And
parity?
think?
Like, is there parity
well,
though?
for
Like, what's the enrollment now
at,
at Ivy
at the
League?
Ivy
Yeah, like
Leagues,
is
I think they're probably mostly female now, actually. I think most liberal arts colleges tend to have a slight female skew, actually. Um, but I mean, the logic I have is like, there is definitely a different atmosphere in a single sex classroom than there is in a co-ed classroom. And definitely women behave differently when there's no men around. And it's really, I think it's a unique, fun experience. It's just that a lot of people don't notice that because they've never really been in that sort of experience. So it's kind of a hard argument to make to people who doubt its value to begin with. Um, but
Yeah.
it's definitely an argument you hear.
Okay. Well, of course you would think that way. You're a lesbian. Which is kind of fair. I mean, I think that, lesbians are going to have kind of a different, and gay men are probably going to have a different take on, sex segregated spaces than heterosexual people.
Yeah, I'm curious actually what gay men would say, because I feel like they have a different relationship to all male environments than lesbians do to all female environments, although I wouldn't
Well,
know for
that's
sure.
maybe true.
I
Yeah.
know that a lot of the heterosexual males in college were very fond of their fraternities. So I mean, having those spaces were important to them, and then the longevity of it as well. So, the gay volunteers have mentioned their fraternities and the fraternal organizations being very important to them. So, I, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily super different for heterosexuals. I think we all benefit, um, regardless of our sexualities, from having sex spaces open to us.
Yeah. The thing you were talking about, Joss, about the bars though, that was so true and very true in my area too, even though we're in clear across the country from each other. It was still very true that, there was just the gay clubs basically. And um I think we had a lesbian bar like that closed like 98 or something, and that was like the last one in the area, and then everything else was just, pretty co-ed. And then towards the end it even got less gay and more straight, and that was kind of interesting. It's pretty much what happened here is just like the straight people pretty much took over the gay bars. Like there's not really any, there's no gay bars that I know of other than like one that's like a real old school gay male bar.
I always got the impression that there were a lot of places where there are a lot of gay men and straight women in the bars, but having like a genuine lots of gay men and lots of lesbians is pretty rare.
I would, it might be. I mean, but I think it depends on the size of the area you're in. Like if you're in a big city, then you probably have like more people, more options. But I think in smaller cities and smaller towns like mine, there wasn't like that wasn't that big of a gay community anyway. So you did kind of share space and you did all kind of know each other, and we mingled pretty decently. Like, we all the young ones all hung out together for the most part. Lesbians didn't tend to separate out from the gay men. We were all like sharing apartments and hanging out together and stuff like that.
And I think that that's like sort of less than single sex spaces, but like towards that notion of gatekeeping, like how important it is for us to have shared spaces between gay and lesbian and bisexual people that's exclusive to gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, because the introduction of heterosexual tourists to our bars really changed the landscape of that also, it, to a point where lesbians were on their like heading out to these spaces, to these hip clubs and whatnot, but also the tourism was very high in the spaces that we did have, especially when we would have a lesbian night at a gay bar. That that was where you saw a lot more heterosexuals turn up.
Yeah.
So the the notion of that sense of community is very absent now, and I find that to be problematic.
And I'm I'm kind of wondering if we would still need that if it wasn't for um the whole trans ideology really taking over the community. I mean, I guess we kind of would, but it really seems like the trans stuff has really been quite devastating as well because it like I said before, it just breaks like all the boundaries. Like it's just there's no respect for anything anymore. Like I mean, even for example, even on like all the dating sites and everything, which so much stuff's online now. And me and you have both, well, we've all been in our groups that we hold and stuff like that, and our social groups, and have heard the lesbians talk about how it's just horrible. It's just like they can't. I mean, first of all, if they even state that they are only interested in females, they'll get kicked. They'll get kicked off the platform that's supposed to be for lesbians.
Mm.
Like that's how like invasive it's gotten. So I mean, so now everybody's decently desperate. The actual homosexuals who want to have homosexual relationships are pretty desperate now because they're like, there's nowhere for me. So I wonder if it would still, if it hadn't been for the trans stuff, if it would still be as needed as we feel like it's needed now.
That's a good point.
It's interesting. I think it still probably would be needed, actually. And maybe the trans stuff is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of really, really making it obvious that it's needed. But I think even before, or even separately from the trans stuff, I think there's like, I mean, the whole problem of like just sort of straight tourists coming in, that sort of thing. I think that still holds sort of independently of the trans stuff. What's weird about the trans stuff is it adds the level of identity to it. So you're now portrayed as some sort of bigot when you
Yeah,
object.
yeah, when you say no, and that's, I mean, every kind of taking a more philosophical look at that stuff and the way humans work, it's every human, we're like, we're tribe people, right? We like to be in our groups and our tribe, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's totally normal and it's healthy, and people need to have their groups. Obviously, there's there's a point where you shouldn't create a group to try to like kill another group. That's not good. But just having your own spaces, especially if you're a minority in a society, um, you're not seeing yourself reflected in that society hardly at all. You're having to come up against a lot of bigotry, even when people don't mean to be. There's still these kind of maybe a sideways glance or some exclusion, and it's really hard to go day in and day out kind of feeling that being ostracized from society. And that's why like having your group if you're a minority is just so important, because you can go there and you can feel like you belong, and you can feel safe too. Like there's so much talk about safe spaces. There is such a thing as a safe space. A safe space, though, doesn't mean that you don't get challenged or you feel like you can say whatever you want necessarily. A safe space is you really do feel safe to be yourself, and you feel really comfortable around the people that you're around. And so every minority needs a safe space, and homosexuals are a minority, and we always will be.
Yeah. And the thing of it, like our like centers, we'll say. Um, Almost every major metro area has a LGBTQ plus community center or something like this. And if anyone has that skeleton key of identity and they can opt in to those centers and make that their space, it it definitely has a different feel about it than um, going to those spaces and seeking exclusively LGBT community, because I think that they're probably the last bastions, like the last holdouts in a lot of areas, because there are so few lesbian bars, there are so few gay clubs anymore. Like our biggest one in this area shut down. I think they're rehabbing it. I'm hopeful that it'll come back, but it was decades that bar was a major scene for the LGBT community, and at any rate, that skeleton key of identity, opening the door, it really does something. It changes the landscape considerably, and you can't find those common bonds with people who aren't really part of that community, that you're just identifying into it.
Yeah. And the other part of that too is that all adults want to find love and relationships and sex, and that's very important. Like humans, that's very important to us. And when you're a minority, especially a minority that's, same-sex attracted, you you want to be able to go to a space where you can like walk up to another human and strike up a conversation or hit on them or ask to buy them a drink and not be scared that you could actually be hurt. Because that's happened and it still happens. It can still happen in the United States, it can still happen in the UK, and it definitely happens. There's still places all around the world where gays are still killed for being gay. So, like, you know, that's why these spaces came into existence. And to a certain extent, they still need to be there for that reason, so that we can walk up and feel safe to talk to somebody. Because I can imagine being in just a regular bar that's just a bar, it's just open to anybody. If I was to walk up to a woman and hit on her, what danger am I opening myself up to there? She might be mad, and I mean that's okay. If you're not interested, cool. But then you have her boyfriend maybe who got involved. Maybe you don't know what you're going to bring down on you, so you just want to like, you know,
Yeah, that's very real. And lesbians already are notoriously bad about even approaching women in general. So, like, it's a recipe for disaster in the sense, like, how do we move forward? How does our community move forward when we're in this kind of like amorphous blob of weirdness where we can't find each other. We can't even find each other in a reasonable way.
yeah.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge, especially for the youth.
My goodness, the reason I couldn't help but laugh. It's awful, but I've been rewatching this movie, Monster. It was the Charlize Theron movie about that serial killer, but there was some very awkward lesbian bar scenes where the Charlize Theron character, who's a prostitute, just shows up in a lesbian bar because her truck is broken down or something, and this actual lesbian there, played by Christina Ricci, assumes that Charlize Theron is a lesbian and goes up to her and very awkwardly hits on her. And at first Charlize Theron is like, "No, I'm not actually gay." And then they get drunk, and of course the story just unfolds from there. But anyway, that's an interesting another example of how this letting the wrong people in can end in disaster. But
And we've talked somewhat about how, not particularly on the podcast, but in conversations we've had with each other and in group settings and stuff, we've talked about how important it is that we own the word homosexual, and that there's nothing wrong with it, and that it does mean we are same-sex attracted. It is about sex and it is about bodies. And I think maybe this is a little bit of that. We have to step up and own the fact that yeah, we want our own spaces so we can find other humans to have sex with. Like, get the hell out. Like, that is part of it. Like, that is a normal human need, and we want to find people that we can, be with.
Yeah,
I wonder if we got sidetracked a little too much in the love and not just be honest about. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you remember when the whole thing was be free to love whoever you want? And it seems like that was twisted on us, though, because now it's like hearts, not parts. Right? Because it's like, oh, it's about love, right? It's not about, oh, sex is nasty. It's not about that. It's about love.
yeah,
I don't know. Just might be the same way that people don't like to use homosexual.
I
maybe
think
like a general uncomfortableness with talking about like people are get very awkward when you start to talk about sex or like are open to that discussion talking about sex in any way. I don't know.
well, people are having less sex than they used to. So, say young people are.
Poor young people.
Yeah, I guess it's because we
That's the
can't find
internet
each other.
stuff.
Yeah, like homosexuals can't find each other, and I don't know. I can't answer for straight people.
But I don't, but there's just a lot of loneliness. like especially it seems among lesbians, there's really a lot of loneliness. And I mean, it seems like that the lesbians even really are lonely just friendship too, like just community, because I, the some of the groups that I've found my way into and some of the private events I've gone to, it really, the young ones especially that come in there are, I mean, when I went to this private lesbian event a couple months ago, there was this young lesbian who came down from Canada to come to this thing, and she actually got up and started speaking about how happy she was to be in this space and find this space, and she started crying, and everybody started crying. It was just like so emotional, and that was just such an impact on me. I was just like, I left there going, our spaces are so important, and I want to fight tooth and nail to preserve them and grow them.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I think that that is the ultimately the thing that will save our community is helping each other, helping each other find each other. It's an awkward way to say it, but um, rebuilding community in that sense, but we do need those physical spaces. We need opportunities to physically, like, it's nice to have groups, and we've been trying to do a lot of groups with LGBA, but online groups are a totally different thing than being able to be in person with people and connect with people. And some of the anecdotes from the stories you came back with are just so moving. Like when you were telling me, I was filled with verklempt when I was hearing stories about this, because it's not anything that I've had in a long time. Between the pandemic, but also a lot of my friends moving away, I lack that um, sense of lesbian, gay, bi community. It's really important. It's really important to us. I think to our health and well-being as a people,
Hmm.
to be able to be around people that are like us and understand us, that we don't have to explain who we are. They know right away.
Yeah.
They get it
And
right away.
and also we have different needs. We have different needs, from health to, housing to work to, it's just all, we just have different needs overall. And it's another reason why it's important to keep our organizations, our, our centers, our spaces for us, because they're there to serve us, and because we have things that need to be addressed in society. And that's how you get stuff done. When you're minorities, you have to come together to create that push.
And Ariane had mentioned like that notion of it not needing it anymore because there were other opportunities available in terms of a college situation. Um, but I wonder how short-sighted that line of thinking is in general, because even though we have all this integration and people are more accepting of homosexuals and women have more opportunities, it's still not parity, right? It's still not parity. So LGBT people do not experience parity with heterosexual people, and women do not experience parity with males. Like, so yes, it's more, but why? Who decided the line? Like, we've had enough now. It's good. It's
Yes.
plenty.
That's
Now it's okay.
Well, that's the whole jumping ahead of yourself because the law changed. Just because the law changed didn't mean society changed. It meant the law is now kind of forcing people to change and kind of holding people accountable for stuff, but it doesn't mean people change. And it because natural change in society and in a social structure takes time. It takes generations, you know. So I think we just kind of were like, okay, we won. It's all over with now, and that's not accurate to the way anything works. I mean,
Well, also, we don't, whoever said we that parity means that you shouldn't have sort of segregated spaces. Like I mean, we don't say like, oh, Presbyterians should have Presbyterian churches because Presbyterians are oppressed in this country. No, we just say, well, duh, different religious groups are going to have different communities that they go to on Sunday or whatever. I I know for me, like I never personally felt like oppressed exactly. but I did feel very lonely, and it just seems natural to want to have community with people that have some trait in common with you, not all the time, but some of the time. It should be common sense, but a lot of people don't seem to get that.
I love your example. It's a perfect example. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have religions that are split up because they have the same thing in common. And everybody's cool with that. Everybody recognizes that that's normal.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant analogy because it, yeah, there's so many different types of religions that people follow. I can't imagine if you're just like, yeah, well, let's let some Episcopalians into that Methodist church today, and the Presbyterians needed, a couple of
Can
Buddhists
you
in there, and like,
can you
just
imagine if the government went up and was just like started telling the Catholics they needed to let the born again Christians in, the evangelicals, and vice versa? Like they were just, you guys are being bigots. You're not allowing this group into your church.
yeah,
Also, can an evangelical identify as a Catholic if they're not practicing or doing it? I mean, like it's that whole like identity thing. You can't identify as something you actually are not. It's not the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when it comes to not biological sex, especially when it comes to sex. Oh my God.
yeah, to biology in general, because
It's ludicrous.
I've seen the Rachel Dolezal thing pop back up recently about race on Twitter, and it's
Yeah.
it's interesting to see the arguments that people attempt to make to justify one and exclude the other, or whatever. To
I've been avoiding that just because I'm like, oh, I just don't want to get into that. But I I do what do you remember? Okay, so what's the main argument? What's the main difference that they say is why you can't compare the two?
because it's not a choice. Because being trans isn't a choice, but being
Oh.
Rachel Dolezal made the choice to identify
But you don't,
as
but
outside
the
of her
thing
race.
is you don't know how she feels inside. If she says she feels like a Black person, then I mean, I don't know how she feels. I
If
can't read her mind.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem of the skeleton key of identity.
Yeah.
How do you say like that it's not a choice for some people, but it is a choice for other people, and there's a line that's drawn at sex and gender versus any other attribute that somebody could want to identify into.
Goes back to that innate thing, which,
Hmm.
is the problem with hooking it up to homosexuality when it's not the same thing at all.
Yeah.
I know on Blocked and Reported they brought up the difference, or is there a difference? And I think Jesse made the argument that gender dysphoria is a recognized medical condition, and hence there's a medical aspect to like the sex transition reassignment thing
Well,
that doesn't exist with race. But that brings up an interesting question of, could you make a medical argument in favor of race dysphoria?
Yeah, I think you
if
could.
if you're platforming gender dysphoria as a thing, that to me that would just be the next logical step to say that you could have race dysphoria, and then really what sort of like beehive did you just whack with a baton and try to run from because it's just like flipping season. You're
I love that analogy. Like, what? Oh, shoot. I think I had a cousin that had race dysphoria. You've all known that person, right? That one person where you're like, who do they think they are?
Well, the thing with saying gender dysphoria is treatable in the sense of like needing to transition. That there's so many levels to that as well, because there's so much argument that it's mental. It doesn't need to be alleviated with physical, but also there's a very wide section now of activists that are saying you don't have to have dysphoria to be trans. That's where we're seeing a lot with the trans NBs, the trans mask, non-binary, such and such, like very long strings of things that they don't have to have dysphoria, that they are trans, and because they say so, we have to change a lot of different things about the way we perceive and engage with the world to not upset them.
Yeah. And this started happening a long time ago too. Like it's just I think it's reached critical mass now, but I remember this stuff was already going around in the trans/LGBT community 2014. So, this was already circling. It was just hadn't quite exploded, I think.
Well, and the explosion point was really 2014, 2015, when HRC and all of these other major organizations were under a lot of pressure to be more pro-trans. And so they outwardly said, sorry, trans community, we made a mistake. Here we go. We're going to include and focus on whatever. And it's those organizations like GLAD that give us the redefinition of homosexuality around gender. So sometimes it feels like we've done some things to ourselves as a community, like saying we don't need lesbian bars anymore. Let's go to the straight clubs and we'll infiltrate them. It's lesbian night. But also, these massive multi-million dollar NGOs have done this to us. And no LGBT people were consulted when they made these decisions that we're going to now define sexuality around gender identity.
Very good point. When and yeah, that's just mind-boggling that like these major organizations that used to represent homosexuals really that they had to represent us because we used to be arrested because we were having sex with the same sex. That's why we were arrested. That's why we were got in trouble. That's why we were beaten up and harassed and all the numerous things, not because we dressed a certain way, not because we identified ourselves as lesbian or gay. It was because we were having sex with the same sex. That's why. And it's like once you lose sight of that actual like core component, you've just lost the thread. So repackaging it as attraction to gender instead of someone's sex is just no, that it doesn't work.
No. And it's caused great harm to our community.
And how
It,
homophobic is that too?
extremely homo- further. All right, you can find this. Everyone can find this right now if you search GLAD. I think it's GLAD Media something or other. GLAD Media. It's basically what they give to journalists to say this is what's acceptable, this is not acceptable. So according to GLAD, homosexual and homosexuality is no longer an acceptable term. It's outdated, and they say it's discriminatory in some way, or I can't remember the exact wording that they use, but the point is that don't say homosexual anymore. Don't say these specific words that are directly related to the homosexual LGBT community. Instead, we're talking about gender. Instead, we're talking about these things that have just queer. Queer is great.
Oh God,
Queer is great.
the
Don't say
queer thing.
homosexual.
The queer thing. Talk about breaking boundaries, obliterating any kind of boundary, like a healthy boundary. Queer just does that because queer tells me nothing about you as a person if I'm interested. You know what I mean? Like let's take the going to the lesbian bar again because I want to meet a girl, a woman. Uh I walk up to you and start talking to you and identify as queer. I don't know what that means because maybe I don't want to get involved with someone who has a boyfriend. Like I don't know. It's just like that tells me nothing.
Yeah. What's your experience, Ariane, with the youth's use of that word? Because I noticed that this tends to run pretty rampant in on media, but also in a like the younger generation, like under around and under 30, it's used really prevalently. It's basically like no more LGBTQ even, it's just queer. Like just everything is now rebranded queer.
Well, my saga with the term queer goes back to when I was in high school. So this would have been 2000 and well, I was class of 2007. So before then, and I remember being told pretty much point blank by a friend of mine who was bisexual that she had a gay teacher at another school who said, "Oh, we're just gonna we're gonna use the term queer as like a convenient catch-all because it's too much of a mouthful to use um, all the different letters that you could use." And so we're just going to use queer. And so that, I guess, I mean, this was the Bay Area. So this was like, probably the epicenter of where a lot of this started.
It
But
was ahead of its time.
yeah, it was ahead of its time. My high school GSA became the gender and sexuality awareness already when I was there. Um, so I definitely was exposed to it from my age group, which is middle millennial. Um, I actually didn't hear it as much when I was in college, interestingly. I even though I went to Smith, I kind of felt like most of the I mean the lesbians would just call themselves gay or lesbian. I actually think queer wasn't as common again until well after I graduated from high school. Um, and I don't I don't really talk to so many people who are like in their 20s, I must admit.
Fair, totally fair.
Yeah, same. I wonder if it has to do with the corporatization of the LGB community and the whole notion of like cop cars with rainbow flags and the Progress Pride flag is everywhere, especially during Pride. But there's a lot of places that kind of rebrand themselves friendly, like they want the gay dollars,
Yeah.
so there's and then just the prevalence of that term in the media as well. Obviously, with organizations like GLAAD saying use it, don't use homosexual, use queer, don't
Yeah.
use LGBT or whatever.
Yeah, but it also seems like this idea of being one big happy family has been really pushed. LGBTQ plus all one happy family. You're not supposed to say anything bad. You're not supposed to have an argument. You're not supposed to disagree. And since we're all just one family, we're going to go by queer. And a lot of the homosexuals buy into that too, because the psychology there is interesting because I think there's some psychology behind if you've been picked on, if you've been harassed, if you've been bullied, you're usually more likely to be more sympathetic towards other people. And I think gay people in general are more sympathetic because we've had a hell of a time, and most of us since childhood. People start picking on us pretty early. They knew we were different. And so that empathy, I think, or compassion has been taken advantage of. And I think that's what's really eaten us up as well is not only internalized homophobia on our own part, but I also think just being too sympathetic, not going, look, no, you can't do this. We don't want to be mean. We don't want to hurt other people like they hurt us.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that like the notion of LGBT family even, was important to me in when I was coming out and then engaging with the world, even as recently as pre-pandemic. I had multiple encounters with women out in the world where we met each other. We obviously like I had my gator. I was like, yeah, I think that's a lesbian, or I think that's a trans man. And then have that moment where you're like, hey, you fam, like that line was just so prevalently used when you were meeting other LGBT people, to just make that like break that ice really quickly and confirm what you think your suspicion was, that you were engaging with other LGBT people. So like the notion of family was really important to me, and I've been a little bit heartbroken about the fractures that have happened in our community. And it's really what's driven a lot of my activism now, is because of like how the tide has turned, and that we don't have like whatever queer did, if it was meant to like have this notion of family or we are all one or whatever, it's done the opposite, because that came in, and then the notion of family where gay men and bisexual men and women and lesbians were all in sharing the same spaces and thriving together and enjoying each other's company and not feeling any kind of way, like any bad kind of way. Now this queer has like it just like it feels like it's the elephant in the room, like it sits on the table and you just kind of have to figure out how you manage around it.
But again,
anymore.
it goes back to identity is the problem, right? Because if you're an actual homosexual and you use queer, that's reclaiming the word. That can be powerful. And we started to reclaim it years and years ago, and use it in activism. So
Hmm.
that makes sense. But when a freaking straight person comes in there and calls themselves queer, it's a slap in the face. So there again, it has the identity. If it was homosexuals all calling, if it was lesbians, gays, and hell, even bisexuals, all same-sex attracted people calling ourselves queer, I'd have less issue with it. It really has to do with the infiltration of people who do not have that experience, who have not had that harassment, who have not had been kicked out of their families, or any of the bullshit that so much of us have gone through. It's a slap in the face to us.
Yeah.
So come to think of it, the one recent defense of queer I heard was actually from an older lesbian, like maybe in her 50s or 60s, who used sort of a similar reasoning that you were talking about, Joss, with the whole idea of like family and unity. She's like, well, we're all so divided. We need to use one word to unify us so that we're not divided.
But
And I
we are
think she
different.
was, we are. And the thing is, I think she was being probably sincere, but naive was sort of the vibe I got from her.
I'm
So
concerned.
I think that's common for a lot of sort of older people who are using that reasoning at least.
I feel like probably also that was the maybe I don't know how old she was, but we did have that generation that was like an act up and whatnot, and that were really pushing to reclaim the term and to use it. And there was a lot of like gender flux and gender queer and whatever. Like there was a lot of stuff that was happening in the early 90s in particular, the late 80s. Like throughout all time, like we're just a different group of people, but the the term itself, like I feel like sometimes older people still have that kumbaya type feeling, that feeling where like they haven't had their heart broken yet. They don't realize what's happened, and that there's all these big fractures in the LGBT community. Like there's, I don't think that they realize, and what they're kind of like letting the kids lead. At least that's been my
Yeah.
experience with some of my older lesbian friends that have teenagers in particular. As like one woman said to me, "Oh, like we're learning so much. We're learning so much. Like he's teaching us so much." And I understand where you want to like commune with your kids or your younger people, or try to understand where they are, but to let them redefine the community, to let them just open the doors to what it means to be LGB and say, now it's all queer, now everybody's in, you can identify as whatever. I don't think that they realize the harm yet because they aren't dating. So they aren't out there in those trying to
Mm-hmm.
find dates. They're in long-term relationships and they're being led by the kids who are just like, yep, this is how it is now. Everything's fair game.
And let's not forget that queer has been historically and even to this day used in a derogatory way. It's a slur. So there's that element too, which is why you can't just throw that around like it's no big deal. I mean, can you imagine? I just sometimes it's kind of weird to think that there's straight people who can just walk up to my face and call me queer now, and that's okay, and it shouldn't be okay. You know.
It's not okay. To me, it's not okay. I'm about real tired of being told about my community from outside my community. I think that's really like my fuse is burnt up. Like where that you can imagine like a really long fuse. I'm a very patient person. My fuse is very long, and that thing is burnt to a crisp. Like it is gone. It's just ashes blowing in the wind. Like I've got no more fuse for people outside of our community who have not, like you mentioned, Carol, have not suffered the discrimination that we've endured, have not had to feel any of those slings and arrows come at them.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what's happening inside the LGBT community.
And what also with the separate spaces, there's also an element to it's about safety as well. And this, I think, is especially true for women. So for lesbian and bisexual women who want to be together in a event or group or club or whatever, you know, we don't want to let guys in there because guys are historically a big frickin' problem when they come in and think that they have a right to be there and a right to women's bodies. And that's yeah, that's a big no. I mean, maybe we can discuss some of that later on. Oh, what's his name, who's still awaiting trial for the murder of those lesbians in Berkeley. There's that situation. It's this
Yeah,
has happened. So
yeah, it's happening, and from the from the lesbian safety, bisexual women's safety, just safety where male intrusion is a thing is real. It's very tangible. But it was very illustrative to me to hear a gay man recently retelling a story of his experience of being in what was supposed to be a safe gay male space for him, and then
oh
having
God, yeah,
his sexuality challenged in that way by having a female identifying trans identifying person engaging him in an intimate way. And
that's right.
that was, I mean, like it's so hard to come out as gay, right? It's so hard to
Mhm.
come out and to go through that whole process. And there's so much homophobia that's directed at us. To then have people just assume that they identify as this thing, so it's totally cool, and challenge the foundation of what it means for each of us independently to be LGB, and to not like have some kind of, I don't know, discussion about it, but I don't like even know how to put it, but like that whole it the boundaries are just blown. The door is blown wide open for all homosexual and bisexual people right now.
That's
Yeah, and
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think as more of the sort of rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort comes of age, that are largely straight girls that are transitioning into identifying as gay men, you're going to see a lot more gay men complaining. It's my prediction.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a horrifying story. I was like, oh my God. And it's also like it's that feeling of he was in a kind of a vulnerable situation too, and then having this like it's just so creepy. That's
Hmm.
so invasive and creepy to be like, ugh. It's like it's be lied to, like, like if you went on a date with somebody and then you get home and you guys are gonna have sex or something, and then you're like, oh my God, you are not the sex you said you were. That shit is horrifying. Like, that's not cool. And that's what's happening because you're identifying as something that you're not.
And then expecting everyone to go along, like it's like people do whatever, right? Like do whatever, but it's forcing the compliance of other people by not disclosing it, or by being in dark spaces where somebody can't tell who they're engaging with, and having the expectation that it is a gay male only space, or it is a lesbian
Hmm.
only space, or whatever. um, it's so um, disrespectful and dishonest. And when you're attacking homosexual people in that way, it is homophobic.
Yes, that is bigoted. That is homophobia. It's
Yeah,
like, jeez.
yeah. It's so much to process. Yeah, I feel like this is a topic that kind of like it just melds into others, and it just keeps. There's so many other points here that blend into each other, and then circle back like an Ouroboros of craziness. But
But this is why gatekeeping is important.
mhm.
Like, gatekeeping is not a bad thing. Or what I think it was Ariane that gave it a better name than gatekeeping. Was it?
I
No.
did. I
Maybe,
don't
I don't
know
know.
if I did.
Somebody called it something else that I thought like sounded a little bit better. It was,
I mean, gatekeeping
gatekeeping.
sound like it does have a sound to it, but it's for a point. Like it's not. Yeah, it's how you receive it, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's boundaries. It's just
Mhm.
Hmm.
boundaries, and It's also part of the Title IX stuff that like it's just such a like every little bit goes into the next little bit like it's just such an expansive thing.
Well, it's
Uh,
because it's such a fundamental thing. Someone's sex is a fundamental thing in society, and our society has for thousands of years, if you're coming from European centered society, and even not, most societies have come for thousands of years of men and women being very separated, very different, women being treated very differently by males generally being in charge. I mean, all this stuff that exists because of a person's sex that they're born as. You can't just, that just doesn't go away. I mean, and also when you start to create laws that make absolutely no sense and have no definition, how do you enforce a law that has no definition? That shit's scary,
it is.
because then it's left up to just whoever to interpret it however they want.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it feels more like, what's the point?
Yeah, imagine if you left, murder, the word murder. Let's just leave that up to whoever feels like it was or wasn't. I
Yeah.
mean, that's I feel like, you murdered someone. I think you should go to jail for it. That is not good.
No, that's not good. And it's so broad. Like all of the laws now we should be calling into question. The Equality Act is still it's sort of dead in the water, but it's still a thing. The Violence Against Women Act, Title IX, the proposed changes to Title IX, all of these things have really, really broad definitions in play or lack of definitions. And in every instance, it really breaks down more of the gatekeeping that has been established to bring parity, to bring safety, to bring security, to bring opportunity, etc. Um, it knocks the walls down on that.
It's no wonder that you have everybody from every political background. You'll find someone from every political background that is like, no, this is crazy. And it's because it is so fundamental that yes, you're going to have a bunch of people across, the political span of things and the cultural span going, we agree on this subject. If you get a bunch of people agreeing on something, they're probably correct, because that's something that's affecting everybody.
Yeah, I think it's just at this point we need to be more outspoken collectively, especially those of us who are politically left and center left. We need to be more outspoken and more fearless. We can take this note from our center right friends and our conservative friends that uh, don't be so afraid. We have to not be afraid to say what we feel and what we think. Because at the end of the day, what I don't know exactly when it occurred to me, but who's gonna cancel us? Like, yes, there are some people have work issues that they need to be protected. There's throwaway accounts. There's not a single social media platform that doesn't have a throwaway account. But we need to be having these conversations in among our friends and our allies and our family. They're difficult. They're unfortunately difficult, but we need to have them, especially so that when your heterosexual neighbor tells you what's happening in the gay community, you don't just go, "Oh, God, I want to say something, but it's going to be really uncomfortable, and I know it's gonna, it's gonna be backlash, and we're not gonna be friends anymore." No, say the truth. Don't let these people come at you with lies and come at you with whatever, and just go along with it because it's easier. It's no longer easier. Now we're at critical mass. It is not easy to just be silent and to be peaceable and to avoid conflict.
Because now this is moving into law,
It's moving into
and
law.
it has moved into law, and it's going further and further, and it's a real mess.
It's serious. It's serious. And we all have a voice. The thing, right? Like, value your voice. Your voice is important. Each of our voices is important. And whatever any one other person thinks isn't more valuable than what you think and feel and experience. Like, if we're going to validate somebody's identity and pronouns and whatever else, it's their particular fiction, why is ours not also able to be validated?
Yeah, why does a certain portion of society's feelings matter more than the other?
Yeah.
Right? Because these are feelings, right? We're talking about feelings. My feeling is just as important, and my opinion is just as important as anybody else's. And more to what you said about speaking out and being active. You can do it in very, very small ways, just by speaking your mind to the people around you, just in your community. You don't even have to go, just your friends, family, just, like you said, when possible and safe, and you're not going to be destitute because, people got to eat. But it does sometimes, it takes just changing one person's mind, or getting a different perspective into somebody's head to get them to start to think about something. It kind of reminds me of how back in the day it was considered a real part of the gay and lesbian movement to come out as gay, right? Because people could get killed for doing that, yet it was kind of this thing where you're like, I have to come out not only for myself but for my community, like, because we exist here. So think about that. Think about what, the people that came before us have done. They've done stuff much harder than this.
Yeah.
This is hard, but it used to be, it used to be rougher. At least it is getting a little better.
Yeah, and I find too that sometimes these conversations that you have with people can go surprisingly well. At least that's been my experience, even with people on the left, that there are a lot more reasonable people out there. I mean, yeah, there are people who aren't. But I think it's worth considering too. A lot of people who are just, like Democratic voters aren't really engaged in this issue. But when you talk to them about some of the problems involved, like with the prison problem or with the youth transition things, there's a lot of, they're like, oh, I didn't know about that, or yeah, I don't feel so good about that. I mean, there are ways you have to, there are sloppy ways of doing it too, but there are ways you can have good conversations about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this horrible, scary experience.
I feel very seen in the sloppy ways of doing that. I feel like that's probably me most of the time, just being like totally abrasive about it.
Well, and there are some advantages to that. It depends on too, what your intention is. Do you want to remain friends with this person? Are you, are you just interested in really, just being strident and making sure that your voice is heard? You don't really care what that other person thinks about you anymore. There are different contexts too.
Definitely.
The sloppy approach does have a use too. Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah, the seed planting approach has been very productive. So like just getting the foot in the door and just saying like, no, that's not how that works. Whatever you just said to me is not accurate.
Do you
whatever.
know how many people J.K. Rowling changed minds? She changed by standing up and saying no. I have several in my own family that before had a very different opinion of things until JK came out and was like, I'm gonna call bullshit on this. And then, the trans rights advocates and the left and so many people just like unleashed on her that she was a bigot and this horrible woman and everything. And her fans, which are the many, went to research this, read what she wrote, and went, she didn't say anything that crazy. What are these people on about? My own mother-in-law is one of them. She's been a super fan for years. And it was this turn that made her go, oh no, these people are nuts. She didn't say nothing wrong. And so, it makes a difference.
Actually, that was kind of similar to me, to be honest. I'm not even like a huge J.K. Rowling super fan or anything. I kind of like the Harry Potter books, but I'm not a super fan. But I was just curious of what the hoopla was about. And I actually read her article. And I'm like, oh my gosh, anyone who responds like that to that article is probably so utterly just deranged.
Well, the sad thing is
self-incriminating. They probably haven't read the article, of course. But
I was going to say the vast majority of people, that's a huge problem that's happening in our society too. No one reads the stuff for themselves. Go read it firsthand for yourself. Don't take anybody's word for it.
Yeah. the headline is not enough. The headline from
No.
your super lefty publication that you've been reading for years and years. This has been very eye-opening for me too, as a very liberal person, is the way that things are contorted very conveniently and to paint a picture. And I feel a little bit upset about it as a liberal. What's happened in some of our politics. And
I
anyway,
I also feel really upset because I always thought we were like the reasonable, logical, scientific ones, and here we are being completely nuts. Like, oh man, humans.
yeah, we're difficult. And maybe that's a good place to stop for tonight. Humans are difficult.
Humans are difficult, but you know what? Get out there and speak your truth. They're
Yeah,
speaking their truth. You speak your truth. Let's all speak our truth.
speak your difficult truth. Yeah,
Yeah.
just open the door. Yeah, get some words in. I think so. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this second podcast. Appreciate you both for taking the time today.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
we'll
Thank
see you
you.
again in a couple of weeks.
Good night.
Good
Or
night.
Good night.
night.